Imagine standing in Chicago in October 1871. The city is burning, buildings are collapsing, the streets are filled with smoke, flames, and people carrying whatever possessions they managed to save. Thousands have lost their homes. Chicago looks finished. But here's what makes the story almost unbelievable. Just 22 years later, the same city would invite the world to come and see something extraordinary. A gleaming city of white buildings, electric lights, monuments, palaces, gardens, and a giant Ferris wheel rising above the lakefront. It was called the world's Columbian Exposition. Millions came to see it, but there was a problem. The beautiful city visitors saw wasn't the whole of Chicago. Outside the fairgrounds was another city, a city of smoke, slaughterhouses, overcrowded neighborhoods, dangerous work, and enormous wealth sitting beside enormous poverty. So how did a city that had been reduced to ashes become one of the greatest spectacles America had ever seen? And what was Chicago trying to hide? On October 8, 1871, a fire began in Chicago. Over the next 36 hours, flames tore through the city. More than 18,000 structures were destroyed. Roughly 1 out of every 3 Chicagoans lost their home. At least 300 people died. For many cities, a disaster on that scale might have meant decades of decline. Chicago did something different. It rebuilt, and it rebuilt quickly. Construction exploded. Railroads expanded. Factories multiplied. Workers arrived from across America and from Europe. Money poured into the city, and Chicago began transforming itself from a regional trading center into something much larger. The fire had destroyed the old city, but in its place, Chicago built a new one. And then came an opportunity to prove to the world what it had become. The United States was preparing to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Columbus's arrival in the Americas. Cities across the country wanted the honor of hosting the celebration. Chicago wanted it badly, and when it won, the city had a problem. It had less than 4 years to build something the world had never seen. The planners weren't interested in building an ordinary exhibition. They wanted a spectacle, something so beautiful that visitors would remember it for the rest of their lives. Architects including Daniel Burnham and Frederick Law Olmsted helped transform a lakefront area into the grounds of the world's Columbian Exposition, and what appeared there seemed almost impossible. Huge classical buildings covered in white plaster, grand entrances reflecting water, statues, gardens, electric lights illuminating the grounds after dark. Visitors began calling the central area the White City, and the name stuck. For a country rapidly becoming an industrial power, the message was obvious. America wasn't simply catching up with Europe. America was building its own future. Chicago wanted the world to look at the White City and think, this is what tomorrow looks like. But there was something strange about that message, because the real Chicago didn't look anything like this. Walk beyond the fairgrounds, and the contrast could be brutal. Chicago was one of America's great industrial machines. Railroads carried goods through the city. Factories produced everything from machinery to food, and the Union stockyards had become the center of an enormous meatpacking industry. Millions of animals passed through the yards. The industry created jobs and enormous wealth, but it also created something else: pollution. Chicago relied heavily on soft coal for power and heat. Coal smoke filled the air, soot settled on buildings, and industrial odors became part of everyday life. Near the stockyards, the situation could be even worse. Animal waste, blood, grease, manure, and other industrial waste polluted waterways. The neighborhoods surrounding the packing plants were home to working-class families, many of them immigrants. So Chicago had 2 very different faces. Inside the World's Fair, white buildings, clean water, gardens, electric lights. Outside, smoke, crowded neighborhoods, industrial waste, and people working long hours to survive. But the most astonishing part was how close these worlds were. Inside the fairgrounds, however, the future had arrived. Electricity transformed the experience. At night, the White City glowed. Visitors could see inventions and technologies that represented the rapidly changing modern world. And then there was the attraction that would become one of the fair's most famous symbols, the Ferris wheel. George Washington Gale Ferris Jr. designed it as America's answer to the Eiffel Tower. It stood about 264 feet tall. 36 cars carried passengers high above the fairgrounds. For people who had spent their lives traveling by horse, walking, or riding trains, the experience must have felt almost impossible. From the top, visitors could look across Chicago, and perhaps that view revealed the contradiction better than anything else. Below them was the magnificent White City, but beyond it stretched the enormous industrial metropolis, smoke rising into the sky, railroads cutting through neighborhoods, factories working day and night, a city becoming richer and more unequal. At the same time, the World's Fair attracted more than 27 million visits during its run. People came from across America and around the world. For many, it was a celebration of progress, but progress wasn't being experienced equally. The people building Chicago's factories and packing houses didn't necessarily live in the world being advertised at the fair. Working-class neighborhoods struggled with overcrowding, low wages, dangerous jobs, and pollution. And Chicago was becoming a city of enormous contrasts. A businessman could make a fortune from industry, while a worker living near that same industry could breathe polluted air every day. A visitor could spend the afternoon admiring the White City's architecture, then return home without ever seeing the neighborhoods that made Chicago's industrial economy possible. And that's what makes the World's Fair so fascinating. It wasn't necessarily a lie. The progress was real, the technology was real, the beauty was real. But it was only one part of the story. Because the same Chicago that could build magnificent palaces in a matter of months could struggle to provide healthy living conditions for the people living beside its factories. The same city celebrating modern engineering was still fighting problems with sanitation and disease, and the same industrial growth that created extraordinary wealth could leave working families trapped in poverty. This wasn't a contradiction unique to Chicago. It was one of the central tensions of America's Gilded Age. The country was becoming richer, more industrial, more technologically advanced, but the benefits of that progress were not shared equally, and Chicago became one of the clearest places to see it. The White City showed visitors what America hoped to become. The streets outside showed what America actually was, and perhaps that's why this World's Fair still matters. The world's Columbian Exposition eventually disappeared. The temporary buildings were torn down, the lights went out, the crowds went home, but the idea remained. Chicago had shown the world that it could rebuild from catastrophe. 22 years after the Great Fire, the city that had once been buried in ashes had become a global spectacle. But the fair left behind a more complicated legacy. It showed the incredible power of human ambition and the uncomfortable price that industrial progress could demand. Chicago wasn't simply a city that rose from the ashes. It was a city that learned how to turn destruction into opportunity. But it also became a city where beauty and hardship could exist only a few miles apart. So when you see the famous photographs of the White City, don't just look at the beautiful buildings, look beyond them. Look for the smoke rising over the real city. Look for the workers. Look for the crowded neighborhoods. Look for the people whose labor helped build the future they weren't always allowed to enjoy. Because in 1893, Chicago didn't just show the world its future, it showed the world its contradiction. A brilliant white city, built beside a much darker one, and both were Chicago.